portrait by Rubens now of Ambrogio da Spinola, a member of a wealthy Italian family who put his whole fortune at the service of Spain and the Catholic side in the conflict with the Dutch and the other enemies of Spain. His victories in the early years of the 17th century were a major factor, leading the Dutch to agree to the truce from 1609 to 21. When fighting started again in the 1620s, he took the Dutch city of Breda in a famous episode, commemorated by one of the most important paintings by Velázquez, which we'll see later this quarter. Despite the presence of such a formidable general on her side, Isabella Clara Eugenia did keep trying until her dying day to keep the peace, and to that end employed Rubens as both a spy and a diplomat. This is a portrait by Rubens of Marie de Medici, who had become the Queen of France when she married Henry IV, and who acted as regent for their son Louis XIII after Henry's death in 1610. She is not well regarded by historians. Her main goal in life seems to have been to try to spend all the money in France, and in 1621 she offered Rubens the equivalent of a multi-million-dollar commission to paint a colossal series of pictures honoring herself and her late husband, to decorate the palace, now called the Luxembourg Palace, which she was building for herself in Paris. The surviving pictures of the commission are now on display, as you can see here, in the so-called Medici Gallery in the Louvre. The exact number of pictures was to be worked out later, but it was intended to be over 40. And being the kind of woman she was, Marie had Rubens begin with the pictures illustrating her own life, and he never got to do more than some essentially unfinished work on the pictures meant to honor her husband Henry. You may remember we saw one of these pictures earlier in which Henry was being shown a picture of Marie as though by a kind of celestial dating service, while Bellona, the goddess of war, whispers to the king that she's just the girl for him, and he does look impressed. In this scene, she's now arriving by boat, while the gangplank is held up by some delicate water nymphs who look like they could play for the Raiders. Rubens has been called the most operatic of painters, and if you're thinking in terms of musical analogs, opera is the one, I think. These pictures are not usually considered among Rubens' most artistically valuable work. William Blake famously remarked that they were the work of a blockhead, but he may have enjoyed painting them more than anything else he ever did, and Marie herself was entirely pleased. Here you can see the one called The Prosperity of the Regency, in which Marie is shown presiding like a mythological divinity over the distribution of largesse. But as I said, she was in fact rapaciously greedy. G.F. Young says she spent more money on clothes than any woman who ever lived. A worthy member of the Shopping Hall of Fame, with the heroines of our own day like Imelda Marcos and Leona Helmsley. Here we see her at the end of her term of office, graciously handing over the power to rule France to her son Louis XIII, whom she in fact disliked very much, and whom she wanted to have replaced with his younger brother Gaston. She was in fact to spend much of the rest of her life trying to get Louis, her own son, overthrown, and died poor and in exile. In 1624, Rubens had gone to Holland, allegedly on personal business, but he was apparently acting as Isabella Clara Eugenia's agent and attempting to talk the Dutch into returning to the truce. That same year, they had signed a treaty with the French directed against the Spanish Netherlands, and when Rubens returned to Paris in 1625, he was in effect told that he was no longer persona grata. Cardinal Richelieu, Louis XIII's prime minister by this time, had probably gotten wind of what Rubens was up to in Holland, and he didn't want a man who was a de facto enemy agent talking up peace with the Spanish Netherlands right in the capital. In any case, the rest of the Queen Mother's commission was never finished, and Rubens was lucky to get paid for what he'd already done. This is a portrait now by Rubens of Isabella Clara Eugenia's nephew, Philip IV of Spain. In 1628, she sent Rubens as her personal envoy to try to work out an arrangement which would keep the English from helping the Dutch if Spain would take a less aggressive role in the conflict with the Dutch on the side of the Spanish Netherlands. Rubens had met and become friendly with the Duke of Buckingham, Charles I of England's main advisor, when they were both in Paris, and he had other English contacts as well, which, in addition to his natural aplomb, way with words, and general impressive presence, would make him a valuable negotiator, despite the fact that he was, as it were, a mere painter. Philip IV knew, however, from his association with Velasquez, that a painter could command respect even from a king, and it was decided that Rubens would be sent to England with the title Secretary to the Royal Spanish Council to see what he could do about arranging an acceptable treaty. As I mentioned, Rubens had already met several important associates of King Charles I, and this portrait, which Simon Schama calls arguably Rubens' greatest, is of the art-loving Earl of Arundel, who was to lose everything for supporting Charles in the Civil War and die in exile in Padua. This is a portrait sketch of the Duke of Buckingham, which Rubens made, probably in Paris when Buckingham was there negotiating the marriage of Charles I to Louis XIII's sister Henrietta Maria. He was much in favor of the war between England and Spain, and despite Rubens' friendship with him, this might have proven an insurmountable obstacle to peace, but he was assassinated just about the time Rubens arrived in England. Charles himself was not especially fond of the Dutch, nor of Protestants any farther left than his own nearly Catholic Anglicanism. Soon, of course, he was to have more trouble with Puritans in England than he could handle, and they were already becoming obstreperous. Without Buckingham to badger him, he was convinced by Rubens to abandon his alliance with Holland and conclude peace with Spain. Rubens was also commissioned by the king to decorate the ceiling of the banqueting hall of Whitehall Palace with work honoring James I, Charles's father. Rubens himself painted the center panel, the apotheosis of James, back in Antwerp, and members of his staff finished off the rest of the work. It has recently been cleaned and is highly praised by some. Here you can see the center section better. That's James at the bottom of the middle oval. It's not obvious from this photograph, but the foreshortening here is very effective and really makes it seem as though it's painted on the interior of a dome. This was, in fact, to be the last work of art Charles was to see before he was led out from this room to his execution 20 years later. Although he could certainly count himself a successful diplomat, and was knighted by Charles in gratitude for his efforts, Rubens was to decline any further such diplomatic service, and he said that he never gave up anything with less regret and just wanted to stay home. He was in his early 50s by this time and never did make any more long trips. During all of Rubens' diplomatic coming and going, his wife Isabella had died, and when he returned to Antwerp from England, he was regarded as a great catch for anyone who would be lucky enough to be the new Mrs. Rubens. We're going to see some pictures by him of some pretty girls in Antwerp now, and hear a piece of music from the Banchetto Musicale, the musical banquet of Johann Hermann Schein, who had no direct connection to Rubens, but whose work was popular all over Northern Europe in Rubens' day. This girl was a maid at the court of Isabella, Clara, Eugenia. This is a painting of the same girl. An anonymous beauty. This is a portrait of Suzanne Formant, who at the time was regarded by many as the most beautiful girl in Antwerp. And this is a painting of the same subject now in the London National Gallery. She was, in fact, already related to Rubens by marriage because the sister of his first wife, Isabella Brandt, had married Suzanne Formant's brother, Daniel. And this is Rubens' portrait of her sister Elaine, whom Rubens himself married less than a year after his return to Antwerp. Rubens was 53 and she was 16 at the time of the wedding in 1630. She's shown here with their first child of 5 they were to have. Rubens also had 2 children by his first wife. We'll hear about Watteau next quarter, and although his Rococo people are not at all like the robust Baroque beauties of Rubens, the feathery brushwork of some of Rubens' later pictures, which makes them almost look like they were left unfinished, gives them something of the look of Watteau's work, though the latter may never have seen these pictures. This is another picture by Rubens of his new wife, Elaine, with 2 of their children, and this certainly does look unfinished, but it may well have been finished as far as Rubens was concerned. Watteau is often said to have been influenced by the paintings of Rubens for Marie de Medici, the ones in the Medici Gallery in the Louvre now, but I find that hard to see. This has much more the look of a Watteau painting than anything Rubens did for the Medici Gallery. This is the picture now in the Prado called The Garden of Love, and it's likely that Rubens painted this more or less to celebrate his marriage in a general sort of way. This sort of picture, which is really a genre painting, is thought to be more typical of Rubens' work sometimes than it really is. Watteau certainly borrowed the basic theme of this picture, as again we'll see next quarter, but this is the kind of picture that really foreshadows Boucher and Fragonard rather than Watteau, in the size of the actors and the general atmosphere of robust good health and good humor. This is another picture by Rubens of Isabella, Clara, Eugenia, who died in 1633, and with her death, following the will of her father Philip II, control of the Spanish Netherlands once again reverted to Spain and to her nephew Philip IV, who now sent his younger brother Ferdinand, the so-called Cardinal Infante, to take over. The 30 Years' War, about which we'll hear more in a week or so, had by this time engulfed most of Europe, involving essentially German Protestants, Sweden and France on one side, and German Catholics supporting the Habsburgs and Spain on the other. In 1632, King Gustavus Adolphus led his Swedes and their allies to a big victory over the Habsburg forces at Lutzen. But Gustavus was killed in the battle. Ferdinand, en route with the Spanish army from Naples to Flanders, then had the good luck not to have to face Gustavus, but the lesser leader, Prince Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, whom his army defeated at Nordlingen, after which many of the Protestant leaders in Germany went over to the Habsburg side. This is a picture of Ferdinand at the age of 18, which Rubens painted when he was in Spain in 1628. He was nominally a cardinal and had in fact been one since he was a boy, but he doesn't look much like a general. This is a portrait which Velasquez painted of him a couple of years later, but even in hunting clothes and with a gun in his hands, he doesn't look exactly dangerous. After the victory at Nordlingen, however, he was greeted in Flanders as a conquering hero and as the savior of Flanders from the French on the one side and the Dutch on the other. Rubens was commissioned to organize the festivities and design the decorations to celebrate Ferdinand's entry into Antwerp. And this is a sketch he made of the Nordlingen victory float, which he designed to be the centerpiece of the welcoming parade. It was recreated for the celebration in honor of the 200th anniversary of his birth in Antwerp back in 1977, and parked in front of the Antwerp Musée des Beaux-Arts. And this is that recreation now. Ferdinand suffered a defeat at the hands of the French shortly after his arrival, but won a major victory over the Dutch at Callao in 1638 that required another effort at float design and parade management from Rubens. But when Ferdinand attempted to advance into France in 1641, he made little headway and had to retreat, blaming his failure on poor intelligence reports and insufficient supplies and financial support. Back in Madrid, this was in turn blamed on the king's prime minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, and it contributed directly to the latter's fall from favor. Ferdinand himself died soon after this, to be replaced by lesser and lesser Spanish viceroys, though at the end of the 30 Years' War, the Spanish Netherlands were still the Spanish Netherlands. This is Rubens' last self-portrait, painted at the age of 61 in 1638. As I said, he took no more part in politics after his return from England and lived more and more in retirement, while still overseeing projects in his studio that were done more with his direction rather than with his brush. He had a stable of very talented assistants, however, and even a work from the studio of Rubens can be of very high quality. Van Dyck was to become the most famous of his assistants and was to have a very successful career of his own in England, of course. But at various times, Rubens also employed Franz Snijders, famous for his animal subjects, and Jan Bruegel, known as Velvet or Flower Bruegel, who was the youngest of the talented sons of Peter Bruegel the Elder. He bought the Chateau de Steen as a retirement residence out in the country near Aloyt, between Antwerp and Brussels. There are over 1,200, mostly very large paintings attributed to Rubens, an amazing number since few prior painters have more than 100 attributions. But how many of these were painted entirely by Rubens' own hand is probably something that we'll never be able to determine. This is the left side of a picture which Rubens did of his new home that is essentially a genre subject of the sort he rarely painted professionally. And the right side, which you see now, can pass for a landscape of the sort again he never painted throughout his professional career. He also painted this picture, the Kermesse or Peasants' Party in retirement, as though to do a Baroque variation on a Bruegelian subject just for the fun of it. Died in 1640 at the age of 63 and was buried in his parish church, St. Jacob, which still stands just a block from his big house in Antwerp. And this is his tomb with the Madonna and Child he painted specifically to decorate it. In his will, he left money for 3 giant funeral banquets and for 500 masses to be said for the sake of his soul. Here's the picture up closer. Some artists have done some pretty serious, not to say pessimistic work as de facto funeral monuments, but this is very upbeat in atmosphere. It's essentially a Madonna and Child with saints, but it's not altogether clear who the saints are, although St. George is likely the fellow at the left, and St. Jerome is the fellow in the foreground with the book and his lion. But why any of these were chosen by Rubens is pretty much anyone's guess. Rubens' wife Elaine, still just 26, but one of the wealthiest widows in Antwerp, remarried soon after his death. None of his children, by either his first or second wives, ever showed any talent or interest in art, which is, in fact, not that surprising. This is a map of the Low Countries now, with Belgium where the Spanish Netherlands were. To the north in Rubens' day were the United Provinces, or Holland, which area is itself today somewhat confusingly known as the Netherlands, or Holland of course. Leiden, where Rembrandt was born, is only about 100 miles from Antwerp, but it was of course across a very important border, established as we've seen during the war in the late 16th century between the Dutch nationalists and the Protestants on one side, and the Spanish and their allies on the other. By the time Rembrandt was born, the Dutch were firmly independent, and the truce which was established during Rembrandt's boyhood was in fact widely criticized in Holland as too much to the advantage of the weakening Spanish Netherlands. Within Rembrandt's lifetime, Holland would become politically and artistically a world-class power, while the Spanish Netherlands, after Rubens' death, would contribute nothing more that gets into most histories of the fine arts. From this point on, the Spanish Netherlands will appear in history primarily as a battlefield for foreign armies. Rubens was the last glory of the Spanish Netherlands. Rembrandt was the first glory of the United Provinces. This is one of the earliest of Rembrandt's dozens of self-portraits, and I have to admit he doesn't look very glorious here. Rubens would never have painted himself on a bad hair day like this. Rubens was certainly a man with a very high IQ and passed for an intellectual, though he had no formal education. Rembrandt, whose father was a prosperous miller, actually had something of a university education since he attended the University of Leiden for a few months at least. But I read once in the Chronicle grab bag, for what that's worth, as a source, that someone had calculated that his IQ was probably only about 110, and here he looks more like the village idiot than a great genius. Rembrandt was briefly apprenticed in Leiden and then went to study with the Amsterdam artist Peter Lastman, who was then regarded as one of the finer painters in Holland. At about the age of 19, he painted, Rembrandt, this picture illustrating the Old Testament story of Balaam and his donkey. Whether or not he was still in Lastman's studio when he painted this, it certainly shows the latter's influence, but it's also the kind of subject which Rembrandt would do over and over his whole life. It's a biblical subject, but without a specifically religious purpose. That is, it was not meant to be an altarpiece, or in all likelihood, certainly, even for some sort of private devotion. It's an illustration, a picture of a biblical episode, a visual translation of that episode. It occurs in Numbers, and Balaam is a kind of wizard hitman who has been paid to go and curse the Hebrews, but his donkey, seeing the threatening angel of the Lord, to which Balaam is blind, refuses to go on, for which reason he's being beaten while saving his master's life. Rembrandt began his professional career back in Leiden, and this is apparently a self-portrait of him at work in his studio in his early 20s. This is a very Baroque sort of picture in the contrast between light and dark, and in the odd and dramatic angle from which we see the artist and his canvas, the latter looming up to confront him with its challenge. He might almost pass for a hero facing some mythological monster, except for the fact that his potato-shaped body, with what John Cannaday calls the undistinguished features of a loaf of bread, looks so very unheroic. Rembrandt was, of course, to use himself as a subject so often, not because, like Dürer or Rubens, he was a handsome subject, but because he was, to himself above all, an interesting one in the largest sense. Rembrandt could paint superficial beauty, but he realized that that kind of beauty doesn't always go with profundity, inspiration, or spirituality. At first glance here, he looks like one of Bruegel's peasants who's been hired to pose, but the more you look at him, the more dignity and presence his figure seems to acquire. Rembrandt never went to Italy, and probably, as one of his biographers has put it, was never above sea level his whole life. But he was certainly influenced by developments in Italian art in his day. Caravaggio had made chiaroscuro, dramatic lighting of the sort we just saw, a very popular feature of 17th century painting throughout Europe, and many Dutch artists had been to Italy and brought that influence back. This is the Procurus by Gerard van Honthorst, lit by just a single candle. And Hendrik ter Bruegen's Smoker, lit the same way. Often, as in these pictures, the use of chiaroscuro seems to be merely a technical device to produce a kind of showy effect. This now is Rembrandt's version of the Supper at Emmaus, also painted when he was still in Leiden in his early 20s, and here the true potential of chiaroscuro to make an important subject memorable is more apparent. Now the candle, or whatever is producing the glow behind Christ at the right, creates an atmosphere of numinous intensity that makes this picture, for its size, and it's only about a foot square, one of the most impressive of all Rembrandt's paintings. Even Caravaggio's own version of this is nowhere near as dramatic. Jesus must not have looked like this when the fellow opposite met him on the road, or he would never have invited him to dinner. He doesn't just say he's risen from the dead, he looks like it as well. And his dinner companion is goggle-eyed in fear and trembling. Some people decide to be Christians, and others are made Christians by some overwhelming experience. And that's what happened to Christ's companions in Emmaus. This is Rembrandt's version of the story of the woman taken in adultery in the Gospel of John, which also depends for much of its effect on lighting. One might say stage lighting, because this almost looks like a scene from an opera with the spotlight on Jesus and the other actors. Baroque art is often described as theatrical, and this picture certainly is that, even though the action itself is not superficially dramatic. The subject was a favorite with Protestants, since the point of it was that not just those who are caught, but all the rest of us are sinners too, and Rembrandt was at least a nominal, though rarely a practicing, member of the Dutch Reformed Church, and certainly viewed the Bible from a Protestant perspective. Although he paints a lot of New Testament subjects, he was also to develop a typical Protestant interest in the Old Testament, and of all great painters, he's going to be the greatest illustrator of the events in that part of the Bible. The fact that he was to have many friends in Amsterdam's large Jewish community probably reinforced this interest. He also painted pictures of St. Paul 2 or 3 times while he was in Leiden, and here he represents him in prison. It's not clear from Scripture how old Paul was, but Rembrandt never painted anyone looking younger than he might have been. Another thing that's characteristic of Rembrandt's work, in fact, is his interest in old age. People like Rembrandt in their 20s aren't usually inclined to idealize old age, but right from the start of his career, Rembrandt was to do this over and over. Even though it sort of looks like Paul's forgotten what he's doing. Now, was I writing the Thessalonians or the Ephesians this time? He comes across, nevertheless, as a powerful and sympathetic figure. And he was another Protestant favorite, of course, also because of things he said, like the just shall live by faith, and there is none without sin, no, not one. In 1631, at the age of 25, Rembrandt moved from Leiden to Amsterdam, which was fast becoming one of the great commercial cities of the world, to take advantage of what would likely be a larger market for his pictures and a better place to seek fame and fortune. He painted this picture, one of many alleged to have his mother as its subject, at just about this time, and he may, I suppose, have done it to take with him as a reminder of her, but I think that this is probably not actually her at all. This woman looks more like the grandmother of a 25-year-old than the mother. In any case, this woman is bathed in the inspiring radiance of Holy Scripture, which again suggests the Protestant emphasis on the Bible and the reading and study of it. Books, in fact, of all sorts are among Rembrandt's favorite props. So here he is in Amsterdam, ready for business, but what are we to make of this self-portrait now? This is not the way people looked walking down the street in Amsterdam in the 17th century. His dog looks embarrassed to be seen with him. And have you ever heard the claim that people pick dogs that look like them? Well, this pooch does look like the Rembrandt of dogdom. The truth seems to be that Rembrandt just liked dressing up in exotic outfits. And one of his biographers says that his studio must have resembled the prop room at Warner Brothers. He looks almost like a dwarf, but no one among his contemporaries seems to have thought of him as abnormally short. He would be more impressive, more like a proper sultan or whatever he's trying to look like, if we only saw him from the waist up, and in fact few of his later self-portraits are full length. When Rembrandt arrived in Amsterdam, group portraiture was all the rage, and this is an example of that kind of thing now. The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Egbertson, painted by Thomas de Keyser. De Keyser was an important painter, and the portraits, taken individually, are fine enough, but the whole scene looks very posed and unnatural. It's not so much a group portrait as a group of portraits of Egbertson's students arranged around the skeleton, presumably that of a recent patient. This now is Rembrandt's version of such a subject, the Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp in the Rutshuis in The Hague today. Here the subjects are all given their full due in portraits, but the arrangement of them, their expressions, the lighting, the whole organization of the scene is much more impressive. Tulp himself was quite an important figure in Amsterdam, apart from his medical achievements. He served as burgomaster, and his daughter married Jan VI, one of the richest men in town, and who was himself a friend of Rembrandt's for many years till they had a disagreement over money we'll hear about next week. As a doctor, Tulp prescribed tea, as many as 70 cups a day, as a sovereign remedy for ailments. But he may have been guilty of a conflict of interest there because he was also one of the major stockholders in the Dutch East India Company. Here's the anatomy subject up closer. The grotesque nature of this might seem out of place in a great work of art, but no one understood better than Rembrandt that great art is not always beautiful in the superficial sense. As I said earlier, the grotesque and the downright ugly are arguably, in fact, a larger part of his oeuvre than they are of the work of any other great artist. Here are two of Tulp's more intense students up closer. It was then as a painter of portraits that Rembrandt was to make his living in Amsterdam for the next 10 years. He was to paint more than 100 portraits and become very rich, marry a wealthy girl and get even richer, and buy one of the biggest houses in Amsterdam. He was a millionaire, and then he went bankrupt, and we'll hear how all this came to pass next time.